I never believed in ghosts, but there was one in my town that always stuck with me. The legend of Miller's Creamery. It was a small ice cream shop on the outskirts, tucked away between long-forgotten businesses, its neon sign barely clinging to life. The place had been around since the early 90s, and for years, rumors swirled about the children who had vanished after visiting. They all had one thing in common. Their last known location was traced back to the same thing, a free scoop of Midnight Swirl. I had driven past the shop countless times, but I never dared to step inside. Not until tonight. Curiosity gnawed at me. Maybe it was the way the cold wind howled through the empty streets, or how the flickering sign seemed to call my name. Either way, I found myself pushing open the door, the bell above jingling, shattering the silence. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Artificial vanilla mixed with something foul, something rotten beneath the sweetness. The place looked frozen in time. The faded checkered tiles, the glass display case with tubs of ice cream sitting under a thin layer of frost, and a cash register older than I was. But it was the man behind the counter that sent a chill down my spine. He was pale, too pale as if he hadn't stepped into the sun in decades. His skin clung tightly to his bones, and when he smiled, his lips curled unnaturally high, revealing small needle-like teeth. "Welcome," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "First time here?" I nodded, suddenly aware of how dry my throat was. He reached beneath the counter, pulling out a small cup with a tiny wooden spoon. Midnight Swirl. The dark blue and black ice cream shimmered under the fluorescent lights. "Try a free sample," he said, sliding it toward me. I hesitated. The stories clawed at the back of my mind, the warnings, the disappearances. But I was here now, standing in the infamous shop with the legend staring me in the face. What was the worst that could happen? I dipped the spoon in and took a bite. The moment it hit my tongue, an unbearable cold spread through my body. My vision blurred. The walls pulsed, the lights flickered, and suddenly I wasn't alone. Children surrounded me, dozens of them. Their eyes were hollow, their skin a sickly blue, their lips trembling as if they had been left out in a snowstorm. Their small, frozen hands reached toward me, and they whispered in unison, voices blending into a single, chilling murmur. "He won't let us leave." I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shop was no longer a shop. It was ice. The floor, the walls, even the counter had become thick, glistening frost. My breath came out in sharp, white puffs. My fingers numbed. And then I heard him, the old man. His voice no longer a whisper, but something deep, guttural, inhuman. "You should have never come." I turned, and he was no longer behind the counter. He was right behind me. His mouth stretched open, his jaw unhinging like a snake's. Rows of tiny, sharp teeth gleamed in the cold light. I tried to scream, but the ice crept up my throat, freezing my breath before it could escape. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the grinning face of the man who had been running this cursed shop for decades, feeding on the souls of those foolish enough to taste his special flavor.
Prom night was supposed to be perfect. I had the perfect dress, the perfect date, and the perfect group of friends to celebrate with. The school had picked an unusual venue, an abandoned hotel just outside of town. It had once been a grand place, full of luxury and history, but it had shut down sometime in the late 90s. People whispered about why, but no one really knew for sure. When we arrived, the building loomed in the darkness, its once white walls now dull and stained with time. The ballroom, though, had been transformed. Twinkling lights draped across the ceiling, a massive chandelier hung overhead, and round tables covered in velvet tablecloths were scattered across the floor. A DJ played music from the far end of the room, and students were already filling the dance floor. At first, everything was perfect. Laughter, dancing, the kind of night I had dreamed about since freshman year. But then, the air changed. It started with the lights flickering, just a quick dimming like a power surge, but enough to make a few people pause. Then there was the strange, heavy feeling in the room, like the air itself had thickened. I tried to ignore it, probably just my imagination. But when I glanced toward the mirrors lining the far wall, my stomach tightened. The reflections were off. It took me a moment to understand why. At first glance, everything looked normal. The students danced and laughed in the mirrors, just as they did in real life. But then I noticed something strange. Some of them weren't moving right. While the real students turned and twirled in rhythm with the music, a few of their reflections lagged behind as if they were struggling to keep up. I shivered and nudged my friend Sarah. "Tell me you see that," I whispered. She frowned, looking toward the mirrors. Her face paled. "What the hell?" Before we could react, the music stopped. The silence was deafening. Every conversation, every movement came to a halt. A crackling sound filled the air like an old record player struggling to work. And then a slow, eerie tune replaced the upbeat prom songs. The mirrors flickered, and then the screaming started. Someone near the dance floor shrieked, pointing toward the far end of the room. The reflections had changed. The students were still there, but they weren't us anymore. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and sunken. Their prom dresses and tuxedos were shredded, covered in something dark that dripped onto the mirrored floor. And worst of all, they were staring at us. Then one of them smiled. Not a normal smile. A wide, unnatural grin stretching too far, exposing jagged teeth. The lights flickered again. This time they didn't come back on. Everything was black. The screams grew louder. I felt bodies pushing past me, panicked students running for the exit. I reached for Sarah's hand, but she was gone. My breath came in sharp, terrified gasps as I tried to move through the chaos, but the darkness was suffocating. I could hear something, whispers, voices calling out names, but they weren't voices I recognized. And then cold fingers wrapped around my wrist. I gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip was unbreakable. A voice, breathy and hoarse, whispered right against my ear, "Stay with us." The lights snapped back on. I was standing in the middle of the ballroom, but it was different. Dust covered the floor, the tables were gone. The chandelier hung, broken and rusted, barely clinging to the ceiling. The walls were cracked, peeling, and the worst part? The room was empty. No music, no students, just me. I turned to the mirrors, my breath catching in my throat. There I was, standing in the tattered remains of my dress. But my reflection didn't match my movements. It smiled at me, and then it whispered, "You were always one of us."
I had been working air traffic control for years, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the night Flight 392 disappeared. It was a stormy night, the kind that made the sky look alive with veins of lightning splitting through thick, rolling clouds. I sat in my usual seat at the control tower, sipping stale coffee, watching the radar screen blink steadily. Planes were rerouting, trying to avoid the worst of the storm, but Flight 392 had reported no issues. A direct flight from Tokyo to Los Angeles, estimated to land at midnight. At 11:47 p.m., something changed. The signal for Flight 392 flickered, then pulsed erratically, the small blip on the radar screen veering slightly off course. I leaned in, adjusting my headset. "Flight 392, this is Los Angeles Tower. You're drifting from your flight path. Do you copy?" Static. Then a voice, but it wasn't the usual firm, professional tone of a pilot. It was a whisper, ragged, panicked. "There's something outside." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The words had been barely audible beneath the interference, but I knew I had heard them. "Repeat, Flight 392. What do you mean by something outside?" More static. Then the pilot's voice again, clearer this time, but shaking. "It's following us. It's moving with us. I don't know what it is. Oh my God." My hands clenched around the controls. I switched to emergency frequency. "Flight 392, declare your emergency. Do you need to reroute?" Silence. Then screaming. A garbled, high-pitched noise ripped through my headset, so loud I yanked it off my ears. It didn't sound human. It was something else, something shrill and unnatural. The radar blinked violently, the blip of Flight 392 twisting into impossible movements. Loops, sudden sharp dives, things no commercial aircraft could physically do. And then, nothing. The signal vanished. The screaming stopped. Flight 392 was gone. The entire control room went into chaos. We tried every emergency channel, sent out distress signals, scrambled search and rescue teams to its last known location. But there was no debris, no wreckage, no emergency beacon. It was as if the plane had simply been erased from existence. For weeks, the investigation continued, but they found nothing. Families of the passengers were devastated. The official report labeled it as an unexplained disappearance over open water. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen on the radar. 1 year later, to the exact minute, my shift began like any other. The storm had returned, as if mocking me, thunder rattling the windows of the tower. I sat down at my console, staring at the radar screen, expecting another long, sleepless night. And then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., a familiar blip appeared on the screen. Flight 392. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. The plane was gone. It had never been found. But there it was, moving steadily toward Los Angeles. The radio crackled. "Tower, this is Flight 392. Requesting clearance to land." The same flight, the same pilot, as if no time had passed. My hands trembled as I pressed the transmitter. "Flight 392, identify yourself." A long silence. Then the pilot spoke. "Why wouldn't you let us land last time?" I felt a cold dread settle in my bones. My throat was dry, my voice barely more than a whisper. We lost contact with you. You disappeared." A pause. Then laughter, low, distant, and wrong. "That wasn't us." The radar screen flickered. The blip twisted, moving erratically again. I yanked off my headset. I didn't want to hear any more. Outside, the storm raged, and somewhere above, Flight 392 was coming in for landing.